Hello, everyone. I'm Ivo Daalder, president of the Chicago Council, and this is World Review, our weekly look at news from around the world. And a lot of news we had this week. Really glad to be joined today by Nirmal Ghosh, who is the U.S. Bureau Chief of the Straits Times. Nirmal, great to see you back again.
Thank you. Nice to be back.
And from Brussels is Steve Erlanger, Chief Diplomatic Correspondent for Europe of the New York Times. Steve, great to see you again.
You too.
And from Washington, Nahal Toosi, Foreign Affairs Correspondent at POLITICO. Nahal, great to see you as well.
It's about to become Senior Foreign Affairs Correspondent.
Senior Foreign Affairs Correspondent. You know, these titles.
How many juniors are there?
None, actually.
Well, this is like, it's good. We're going to talk about Germany, where titles are very important. But that's great. Congrats, by the way, and well-deserved, because we love reading all your stuff. But now we're going to listen and hear from you. Let's start with the big story that, when it was first announced, didn't seem to be a big story until it really became a big story. The announcement of a security partnership between Australia, the United Kingdom, and the United States. Nirmal, by chance, when we were preparing for the week about what kind of stories to talk about before it was even announced, you said, you know, there's this thing coming out you should pay attention to. So you were paying attention. I wasn't. Tell us about what this new AUKUS, I think is how it's pronounced, security partnership is all about. Where did it come from, and why did it all of a sudden emerge?
Right. So this new pact, AUKUS, is easily the most significant thing to happen in decades in the Asia Pacific, or the Indo-Pacific, as we call it now. It makes the US and the UK high-tech defense partners of the Australians. And most significantly, Australia could, in a matter of 2 years, have a fleet of nuclear-powered submarines, which will obviously dramatically enhance its reach and power projection capability. So what does this show? A few things. Reports of America's decline are greatly exaggerated. There's been a lot of worry about this in the wake of Afghanistan. But it shows that the United States is still the preeminent global power, and it was in Australia's national self-interest to hitch closer to a power that can deploy huge resources in the region. The nuclear-powered subs deal comes with a lot more. It comes with Tomahawk cruise missiles. It comes with US maintenance and logistics, personnel. We saw Defense Minister Dutton not ruling out basing as well in the future. So this makes sense for the US and Australia in terms of deterrence. As we know, the Australia-China relationship is not in very good shape. Australia with nuclear-powered subs would have much greater reach and capability, also much better interoperability with US and UK forces in that arena, no longer second cousin to the US in particular. And we mustn't forget the Quad as well, which includes Australia and the US and brings Japan and India into the picture. We'll have to watch what happens at the Quad Summit in DC next week. But basically, the US is leveraging Australia's geographical position to support a more robust posture, forward military position in the Indo-Pacific, which is important to counter China's anti-access and area denial strategy. And nuclear-powered subs have, offer multiple dispersed strike capabilities. So another issue, is it a slippery slope? Are we in an arms race? Of course we are. On the nuclear front, China has said this is proliferation. Australia and the US say it is not, and of course it is not in terms of nuclear weapons. But some have argued that we will eventually see major powers in the arena, Japan, for instance, maybe even South Korea, go the nuclear weapons route so that there is parity all around. Be that as it may, that is some ways up the road. And meanwhile, we have to worry about the US-China tension turning into something kinetic over Taiwan, perhaps. The best we may have to hope for is a sort of dangerous détente between major powers armed to the teeth in that region. I mean, frankly, it was a relief to many that General Mark Milley had the phone number of his Chinese counterpart, but we can talk about that later. As far as Southeast Asia is concerned, and Southeast Asia, of course, is a critical component in the region for its supply chains, its services. They're not averse to this AUKUS at all, with the exception of Indonesia, which has not always had a happy relationship with Australia. But Southeast Asia would tank very badly if the US and China actually had a clash. And unfortunately, it looks like hawks on both sides are almost hankering for war. I mean, if you watch right-wing channels here, Fox and further right, they talk as if the US is already at war with China. And this is very, very dangerous. I would say the next 10 years will be the most volatile as China continues to rise and its leadership becomes more in part recklessly nationalistic and Washington feels less secure. Now, from China's point of view, and this has to be acknowledged, this is encirclement. And moreover, if you are a Chinese nationalist, you are seeing the old colonial power, the UK, coming back, this time ganging up with others in sort of dreams of once again ruling the seas, and that's not good. And it's not as if China doesn't have cards to play, economic cards as well. But China has sort of earned this. China has alarmed everyone with its wolf warrior diplomacy. We've seen China just go ahead and change the status quo in the South China Sea, facing very little pushback. It has forcibly changed the status quo on the Himalayan border with India. It has taken Indian territory, or technically territory claimed by India, and it has kept it. So all this is arguably very much blowback for the way China has been behaving, which belies the peaceful rise rhetoric we've been hearing, we used to hear. The last couple of quick points. France is upset with both Australia and the US, and Australian taxpayers are going to have to pay more for all of this than they were going to pay for the submarine deal with France. So these are issues that still have to be sorted out.
That's a great summary of and analysis of what's been happening, and how really significant and transformative this deal is. That in the first reaction in the U.S. media seemed to not really generate a lot of interest. That's of course changed in the last 24, 48 hours or so. I think on the subs, they're going to take 18 months to negotiate the deal. It'll take a little longer to get those things built. It'll be probably in the 2030s before they actually get to be deployed by the Australians. But certainly a big deal. Steve, Nirmal already mentioned that not everyone thinks this was a great deal. On the one hand, you're seeing that the pivot to Asia that everybody was talking about back in 2011 really is coming to fruition now. In some ways. So in that sense, it's not surprising, but somehow Paris was caught off guard. Europe was caught off guard by what happened. What's the reaction been? Why has it been as vociferous, at least from Paris? And how are the Europeans starting to deal with this?
Well, it's true the French are enraged, and one can understand why. It's a big contract. It involves a lot of money. It involves a lot of jobs. And only a couple of months ago, it seemed to be reconfirmed by a French-Australian meeting. And the French feel they were certainly betrayed. Knife in the back was what Monsieur Le Drian said, who was the defense minister who negotiated the deal and who is now foreign minister. But so it's a blow to French amour-propre. But it is also kind of isolates the French, and this is more of a problem. It brings Britain back into a very important Indo-Pacific role, but not as part of Europe. France sees this as feeding its narrative of European strategic autonomy, arguing that with Afghanistan and now this, the Americans are not going to be reliable allies forever. But I think some Europeans will see this as over-egging the pudding, that this is a bilateral defeat. It's not a European Union defeat. And if France doesn't get, particularly the new German government, whatever that is, on board for a more serious defense spending and pulling away from Washington, France will seem pretty isolated. I think that's the big worry in France, frankly. That's why they're upset about it. They also have interests in the Indo-Pacific, but there's really nowhere France has security interests where the Americans actually aren't already helpful to them. And that is both with Russia, it's in the Sahel, and also the Indo-Pacific. So my guess is this is embarrassing. It will make people angry, but in the end, it will blow over. But, when you look at this combined with Afghanistan, combined with Nord Stream 2, where the Biden people basically threw the Ukrainians and the Poles under the bus in the interest of a better relationship with Germany, here the Americans will argue, well, we now have a much better relationship with Australia, but doing so by throwing the French under the bus. So it depends which ally is useful at any given time. And I think that's part of the question. So Europe has to think pretty hard about where it sits and what it wants to do and how it will balance itself with America and China, because this rivalry is getting very tough, very fast. It's forcing people to choose. In a way, you can argue you've almost integrated the Australian Navy into the American front against China, even though Australia asked for it. And the Chinese don't like alliances. They think they lead to confrontation. That's one reason, of course, because China doesn't have a lot of alliances. But in Europe, it is a moment of thoughtfulness, and a lot, as I say, will depend on how the French decide to play it, how they calm down, which they will eventually, and also what kind of German government emerges. And I think that's what's going to happen. But it's embarrassing. It came out the day Ursula von der Leyen gave her State of the European Union address, the day the European Union put out its Indo-Pacific strategy. And, one can ask whether the pivot to Asia, which is finally real, is pivoting away from a 100-year pivot to Europe. That's a legitimate question.
All really big concerns that are being felt not only in France, but I think this larger question, Steve, that you just put of are we pivoting away from anything or going toward away from Europe as we go towards Asia, a longstanding issue. Nahal, Steve also talked about allies being thrown under the bus in a whole variety of circumstances, France now being the latest one, by an administration that prides itself of as being more alliance-minded than any other, certainly than its predecessor, which is not hard to do. But they don't seem to have kind of calculated this kind of backlash that they got. What was the thinking, you think, at the State Department and the White House and the Defense Department about this larger picture of how one manages and communicates with allies on this issue, following, of course, after Afghanistan, Nord Stream 2, the original Afghan decisions, and others?
Yeah, this is an administration, like you said, that really values this concept of allies. I think I used to joke that Tony Blinken woke up in the morning and the first words out of his mouth were allies and partners. But I get the sense that this was a pretty close hold topic, and so perhaps not as many people in the administration knew about it as should have been looped in, and perhaps that meant that there was not as great an interagency consultation process as there could have been, which probably affected the messaging. And so I just feel like what ended up happening was, this is sort of speculation on my part, but just, a few people pushed this through. Others were kind of shunted aside. And that this basically, led to a decision that I think overall the administration underestimated the kind of blowback they were going to get from France and the others. At the same time, you got to remember, this administration tries to have a long view on certain things, right? So when it comes to Afghanistan, they'll say, yes, things look really bad now, but 8 months from now, people aren't going to remember, and it's not going to affect, the politics of the midterms or anything. And they're probably thinking, yeah, the French are really mad right now, but what are they really going to do in the long run? At the end of the day, we're still the United States. We're still the biggest kid on the block. So I think there's some of that. You could say it's a bit arrogant. And I guess we'll see how it will play out. One other point I wanted to make, though, was this is coming at a time when the U.S.-Chinese relationship is not in a great place. And I'm not just saying that. We all know that. But what I mean is, even communication-wise, it's not in a great place. President Biden just spoke to Xi Jinping a few days ago, and they set up this phone call because the Biden administration felt like the lower level contacts were going absolutely nowhere. The discussions were stalled. The Chinese were breaking protocol, and they were constantly trying to connect issues like climate change, where the U.S. wants to cooperate, with their own internal affairs, where they want the U.S. not to say anything. And they're trying to connect these things, and the U.S. was trying to get the message across look, we can both compete and cooperate at the same time. But the readouts and, from what we're hearing about the call with Xi Jinping, that did not go well. Apparently, there was a report that Biden even said, let's meet up, and she expressed no interest. So that's, in terms of communication, it does not look great right now. And I don't know, unless Mark Milley is still making a bunch of calls to his counterpart.
And who knows? Yeah, go ahead, Steve. And I want to get Nirmal also on the China issue in particular.
I mean, just one quick thing about the French, which one needs to remember: the French-American relationship is always rivalrous in terms of who we are, what we represent, but also militarily. I don't think, the question is, why wasn't the French brought into this alliance, right? And one reason is the Americans don't want to share their nuclear propulsion technology with the French. These countries, AUKUS, are all members of Five Eyes, so they're already trusted. When Jim Jones, who you knew very well, was National Security Advisor, he wanted to bring the French into Five Eyes and was told very clearly by the CIA and by Pentagon, no. So I think this is really underneath part of what happened. That's all.
And that feeds the narrative, right, Steve, of the Anglo-Saxon once again sort of leaving the French in particular behind, which is, and you even hear it in the language coming out of Paris. A very apt. Nirmal, this point that Nahal had about this growing confrontation, you said the same, between the Chinese. I mean, in some ways, it was the Australians forcing the issue because they had decided that there was no option really for a cooperative relationship anymore. When Morrison was elected in his first foreign policy speech, by the way, at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, a big speech, he talked about not wanting to make a choice and not needing to make a choice. Now he made a choice. And the same, of course, is true in Southeast Asia. No one wants to make a choice between China and the United States, with the Singaporean prime minister saying, don't force us to make a choice because you may not like the answer. But the reality is that you described, this confrontation is forcing people in one form or another to make a choice. How is that seen in Southeast Asia in particular, but also in Japan and Korea? And are we getting into bloc politics, even though no one wants to be in bloc politics?
I think so. I think we are getting into bloc politics. When China says this is like a Cold War zero-sum mentality, frankly, it looks like that. For Southeast Asia, this is a welcome development. Most of the countries in Southeast Asia want, of course, as we know, the U.S. to remain robust in that arena, right, in the Indo-Pacific. The only one that sort of dithers in South Asia is India, which is part of the like-minded democracies that compose the Quad. So that's another large piece of the jigsaw, which is hopefully going to fall into some place next week in DC with the first ever in-person summit of the Quad. So we'll have to see how these pieces fit together. But the Quad is not a pact; it's a security dialogue. So we'll have to see where that goes. But yeah, I mean, this is again welcomed in Southeast Asia because it's an indicator of U.S. commitment. And they just want the U.S. to be there as a balancer. They do not want to end up like China's backyard. And China has converted almost half of mainland Southeast Asia into its backyard, basically, Cambodia and Laos, for example. And they don't want that going any further. So this is a welcome development generally for Southeast Asia, again, with the sort of caveat of Indonesia, which is one of the bigger powers in the region. And Indonesia is somewhat not very happy with the idea of Australian submarines wandering around, in its waters. So with that caveat, I think they generally welcome it. But again, the rhetoric is very disturbing. The wolf warrior rhetoric that I think it was, I forget which country, or was it countries are just dirt on the shoes of China and so forth. All that stuff really freaked people out in the neighborhood. And the fact that China was so emboldened as to actually use physical force on the border with India, it woke India up majorly. And India has mobilized troops and all that. But China got what it wanted. It managed to make incursions and kept some of the territory that it had. And now with the U.S. vacating Afghanistan, again, China has got interest in Afghanistan, in a copper mine in Afghanistan. So now it's interested in stability. It's got ties with the Taliban. So not ties, but relationship with the Taliban. So, I mean, I know I'm sort of ranging further away than Southeast Asia, but generally speaking, I think as long as this doesn't turn into a hot war, in Southeast Asia, everybody's fine with a more robust American position in the South China, in the Indo-Pacific in general.
It's something we will continue to watch closely, because this confrontation, competition, lack of cooperation between the United States and China and its impact.
Yeah, I mean, just one more additional point, since you mentioned, sorry, they mentioned a competition, cooperation. It's very hard to see this actually working at the moment, and I think we talked about this before a couple of months ago. For example, on climate change, they're supposed to cooperate. We don't see any real signs of that. So we still have to figure out how this competition where necessary and cooperation where possible is actually going to work in real life. The fact that the two leaders don't seem to be able to meet. Xi Jinping hasn't, left China lately. Is not cause for optimism.
No, I think that's a point well taken. And I think the way the Chinese treated John Kerry when he came for meetings with only have lower level officials is underscoring. I think the Chinese are saying it's not either, it's not and, it's either or. It's either cooperation or competition, but not both. We'll see how that plays out, because it's going to be a tough nut to crack for the relationship going forward. Let's switch, Nahal. We were talking, and you mentioned, Nirmal, Afghanistan. So good way to go to our next topic, which was that the Secretary of State found himself on the hot seat, both physically in the Senate hearing rooms and remotely from the State Department, being grilled by the House Foreign Affairs and Senate Foreign Relations Committees. His defense colleagues are going to do the same in a couple of weeks over Afghanistan. You covered the hearing and everything that surrounded it. What do you take away from both the way the administration is defending its actions in Afghanistan, the way Congress is looking at the concerns that it has, and overall the standing that Tony Blinken, who was a staff director of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee for many years, now has with the U.S. Congress?
Yeah, it's really interesting, because I believe it's the Dutch foreign minister that just resigned over what happened in Afghanistan, and the British foreign minister was basically pushed out. And yet in the United States, no one has been fired or resigned over what happened in Afghanistan. And look, if I had to bet, no, I think personally that Tony Blinken's job is safe for now. But this was one of the pretty rare times in his life where he has been enduring an intense amount of criticism. He's lived a pretty charmed life. He testified before the House and the Senate, and he kept his cool through pretty much all of it. I mean, that's just kind of the guy he is. He's pretty unflappable. And he used the same strategy that the administration has been trying to use from the start, which is basically just saying, look, we had to make a decision. There was no way this was going to go about perfectly, but we actually did the very best we could. And we actually did a pretty good job considering, right? So he kept emphasizing the positive things, like how many people they did evacuate, versus the negative things that Republicans and others would bring up, like, why didn't you move quicker on, getting people out? Why didn't you have a more robust SIV processing system than you did? And he kept rebutting that with basic things like, look, I sent 4 times as many people to process these visas. So his strategy, as people told me, and they stuck to it, was to stick to what they saw as the relevant facts. And what you ended up seeing in the House was pretty typical. I mean, there were a few House members who used it to make a bunch of drama. I'm pretty sure it was in the House where somebody mentioned Hunter Biden and tried to connect Blinken to all of that. The Senate was a bit more stay it and more normal. But there was some pretty intense discussions, and it was really interesting to me actually to see the Democrats use this as an opportunity to criticize an administration that represents their own party. And so it was pretty clear they were trying to say, look, we are able to criticize our own, but they also couldn't go too far, right? And I will just one last thing, which is that I don't know who made the decision on having Blinken go first versus Lloyd Austin going first, but Austin definitely is got the upper end of this, because he's gonna, by the time he testifies, I'm guessing there's gonna be far less attention to this. And so it's Blinken who will probably walk away with the image issues after this, as opposed to the Pentagon's chief, who frankly had a lot more control over a lot of the stuff that was happening than the State Department did.
It's a good point. The Pentagon, which has been blaming the State Department, or these people in the Pentagon blaming people in the State Department for the mess that we have seen, and yet Blinken is falling on the sword, and he did it well when it comes to falling on one sword. Steve, Nahal rightly mentioned that Foreign Secretary Rob was promoted out of his job, as they say, and surprisingly, the foreign minister of the Netherlands, Sigrid Kaag, who was a big election winner in the last election, resigned because the parliament voted a motion of no confidence in her, or in the cabinet's leadership. They're probably the only ones who are resigning, but there is this question on Europe where there is a sense of accountability that it doesn't seem to be in the U.S. In the U.S. system. How do people in Europe look at that?
Well, the parliamentary system, as you know, has different set of responsibilities, and I admired Ms. Kaag for doing what she did. She's the leader of her party also inside this complicated coalition, and her career isn't over and her life isn't over, and maybe it's even enhanced because of this honorable decision. Now, Rob, I wouldn't say resigned. I would say Rob was fired. And why was he fired? Partly because he was on holiday part of this time and didn't come home, and because among Tory voters, he's not very popular. When you look at Boris Johnson's reshuffle, the bottom four in popularity in the Tory party were the ones who were reshuffled. Now, Rob has been very important to Brexit, and he has a constituency inside Parliament, so it was important to actually keep him. I mean, our system is really different. I mean, I remember when Cyrus Vance resigned over the failed raid in Iran, that sort of Taba raid, and that was considered quite an extraordinary moment of, American European style responsibility. But we don't see it very often, and we don't do reshuffles. And I think a lot of what will happen to Blinken is they put him forward because he's so good at this, and he's very close to Biden. But certainly in Europe, the sense that these are competent people dealing with allies has been deeply damaged, that's all. I mean, it's not like they didn't think America first wasn't still real, right? And that American interests would be important under Biden as they were under Trump, as they were under Obama. There's a general understanding that there's been a structural political change, and that America is deeply partisan and sort of deeply divided. But you press Europeans, even the ones who whine the most, they'd much rather have Biden than have Trump back again, or a Trump-like person. And so I sometimes suggest to them they better be careful what they actually wish for, because they may get their worst nightmares back. And so I think the criticism in Europe really is limited, and they know the Biden people really are committed to Europe and to European security. The worry, which Macron will articulate better than most, is if something goes wrong in the Indo-Pacific, then the force structure in Europe could change really fast. And where does that leave the Europeans if Russia decides to take advantage of it in Estonia or someplace? So, but in general, you know, they're angry with the Biden people, but they'd rather have them than the alternative.
Nirmal, Afghanistan didn't have the same impact, it seems to me, in the Asia Pacific as it is in the transatlantic relationship, in part because of the large scale participation by European and NATO members, and in what was, after all, a NATO mission. What was the reflection in your part of the world to the grilling that the Secretary of State had? Is that seen as that's what a healthy democracy does, or how was it looked at?
Yeah, it's seen as what a healthy democracy does, to use your phrase. And I think Tony Blinken he kept his cool, and in the face of some of the grandstanding that we saw, especially in the House. But what happened in Afghanistan is a worry to Southeast Asia security experts because of the past ties between radical militants, jihadi militants in Southeast Asia and Afghanistan. They trained in Afghanistan and so forth. They went to help fight the Soviets in the old days, and all that. So that is a problem, a worry, a very real worry. And of course, it is the biggest worry in South Asia, where one thing that was missing actually from the sessions that Tony Blinken had is there were a couple of questions on Pakistan's role, but not really anything about holding Pakistan accountable or anything. But, you know, you had Pakistan's intelligence chief, the ISI chief sitting in Kabul, being the broker, actually. And you have designated terrorists in positions of power in Afghanistan. So while all this was sort of focused on the debacle, the botched thing, the sort of idea that the administration is trying to sort of snatch victory from the jaws of defeat by saying, "Oh, look, this was an amazing evacuation, biggest ever," and all that. But the fact is, it was a defeat, and over the horizon capability in terms of detecting and disrupting terrorist plans in a country the size of and complexity of Afghanistan is greatly exaggerated. I think it is very difficult. They are blind on the ground in terms of intelligence. And I think these larger issues were not covered in the congressional hearings, which was only focused on the immediate, the last month, and didn't go into the larger strategic implications of it, which are very worrying for South Asia and to a degree, Southeast Asia. Again, the US took a blow to its credibility with this kind of withdrawal, and the timing was terrible, just on the eve of the 20th anniversary of 9/11, horrible timing. So the US is building back some of its credibility with AUKUS, which we talked about before. But the principal worry is that Afghanistan will become once again a breeding ground for jihadi radical terrorist movements.
Really important point there, Nirmal, and there was a time when Congress's oversight would not only be about accountability, but also about understanding strategic directions. And you're absolutely right that lacking a real detailed examination of what now and what comes next, as opposed to what happened, may well have been a huge missed opportunity for the nation, because we all need to be aware of the issues that you rightly raise. But that's what democracy is about. And speaking about democracy, Steve, we're back in election season. We'll talk next week about the Canadian elections, which have interesting twirls, at least in the campaign. We'll see what the outcome is. But boy, the most stable place where we know the election outcome years before is Germany. And turns out we may not know election outcomes in this case. It remains a really interesting set of issues. And why do we care about about the European elections? Because this is replacing the leader of Europe, and in some ways the leader of the free world, with Angela Merkel taking her leave from politics. and the question is who's going to take her place and what the impact is on Europe. So bring us up to date about where we are in Germany.
Well, we are slogging our way to a vote on September 26th. And after that vote, we will slog our way through coalition negotiations, which are going to take months. Germans talk to me happily. It might go quickly. We might have a government before Christmas, they say. Last time it took 6 months after the election. So the difference, what you have in Germany now, you have fragmented parties. I mean, and what makes it poignant is this is the end of Merkel. Always before, when you had an election, you kind of knew who was going to be chancellor at the end of the process. This time you don't know. But if the polls are at all accurate, you're going to have a three-party coalition, which will make things very complicated in terms of having a government that's willing to do anything. That's the problem. Because if you have a chancellor who wins 24% of the vote, his party, that's not like winning 40% of the vote. It's already weakening. Merkel, at her best, got about, her CDU-CSU alliance got about 40% of the vote. The current leader now is a very kind of decent, normal, not very inspiring finance guy, former mayor of Hamburg, called Olaf Scholz, who is very close to his French counterpart, Bruno Le Maire. He knows Europe. He's been head of ECOFIN when he was German finance minister. If he doesn't win, you get Laschet, who's the CDU guy, but who's also, born in Aachen, a very kind of French-facing, traditional West German. But he comes from industry land, from coal country. And Hamburg is different. Hamburg is much more international. It's a port. It's the most British part of Germany. It's much more outward looking. And so Scholz is much more about trade than about industry. I would think the Greens would have to be part of any coalition, and it'll be very interesting about that. But the party to watch is this quite small, free Democratic Party, who is likely to be the kingmaker, because they could go either way. They could either go with a Scholz, vaguely center-left led coalition with the Greens, but the Free Democrats are very pro-business. They're anti-tax. They're anti-collective debt inside Europe. So if the head of that party, Lindner, becomes finance minister, Macron's dreams of big Europe, integrated Europe, are going to be much more difficult. Or the Free Democrats could go, as I think they would prefer to go, with the CDU, with the traditional Laschet, and also with the Greens. Then you might have actually a more unified ideological German government that would be able to do more. But I don't expect a lot of change. And the important thing to realize is Emmanuel Macron gets elected in April of next year. So that's pretty soon. And France will be the president of the European Union as of the first of the year. But it is very likely that, as usual, timing is wrong, and that what he wants to do, the German government won't be ready to help him do. So I just fear there's going to be a bit more what we're used to in Europe, which is inward-looking stasis. Germany will be stable. I mean, and anyone who could possibly lead Germany is a pro-European, pro-American leader. I mean, that's not the problem. And Germany will continue to exercise stability all around it, which is one of its great strengths, economically and politically. Inside the EU, it's unlikely to have the same stature right away. And the big question is, can Macron work out a deal with the new German government that doesn't scare Germans to death and allows him to make some real progress? The only other thing I'd say, which is really interesting to me, I've spent a lot of time in the eastern part of Germany, and there you have, very strong showing from the far right alternative for Deutschland, which is very anti-immigration, and the Die Linke, which is the left, which is the inheritor party of the East German Communist Party. And they're both probably going to be left out again of any government. So the kind of sense of alienation that the eastern part of Germany feels may also continue. And that's a problem too.
Yeah, and in fact, ultimately that last point, Steve, may affect the stability of the political system in Germany, not to the extent that it will fundamentally change things, but probably make people more inward looking even then. And Nahal, it seems to me there's an issue here for the United States. The U.S. sort of has made this bet on Germany in many ways, and that was true under Obama. Of course, it wasn't true under Trump, but it is, again, seems to me, true under Biden. Blinken, when he went to Germany a couple of times ago, said that you're our best friend, Germany, and which the French were not very happy about when they heard that. But nevertheless, there's this bet on Germany, and yet the politics in Germany post-Merkel are going to be pretty mushy, as Steve sort of has said. How do you work together with a German government that is in a caretaker status for quite a while and will have a very strange kind of ideological alignment no matter what the coalition is, just by the nature of the division of politics in Germany? So how do you think the administration is going to deal with that issue?
I don't have like some brilliant insight on this. I'm not even going to pretend that I do. I mean, my guess is simply that they're just going to take what they can and go along and deal with whoever they have to deal with. I just, there's so many, you say that the Germans will be in a caretaker status. I mean, there are so many unfilled positions in the US government right now, including ones that are supposed to deal with Europe and NATO, that like, I just think everyone is going to be in this mode of like just handling things as they go along. I do think, both countries have, strong systems of civil service and things like that. So I think that the general connections are not going to be really affected unless there's some major external shock or something. But, in terms of overall, I just think it's going to be pretty stable. I do have one question though, and again, this is partly because I just haven't been focusing too much on Germany lately. I was curious if there could be any change on the Nord Stream 2 front with whoever comes into power after Merkel. Do any of you folks know that?
The SPD in general, which is Scholz, I mean, this has been their project going way back. So it's awkward for them. I think it's too late, frankly, to stop it. I mean, the Germans, I think, have basically agreed with the Americans that if the Russians misbehave, then we can have sanctions and we can cut off the gas. But I think it's basically done. And what's interesting to me right now, the Russians seem to be playing games with European gas supplies, which partly to make sure that Nord Stream 2 gets certified and can start flowing. Otherwise, European gas prices are going to go up even higher. No, everybody's, I mean, people are embarrassed by it. The CDU basically is against it. It has been against it, but it's essentially finished. And what the new German government has to do is find ways to pacify the Poles and the Ukrainians and its other European allies, and say that, yes, we know we let national interests get ahead of ourselves here, but we really, are not, in bed with Russia, and we intend to make sure that Ukraine especially gets transit fees past 2024. That may be a hard thing to promise, but that's what they're saying. So I think it is, as what the Germans would say, it's vorbei, it's gone. It's done.
Yeah, and even though the Greens, of course, have always been against the project, but Absolutely. Getting them in government, it's probably too late. for those who don't really know how coalition politics work that Steve was talking about, watch Borgen, the brilliant Danish political show on Netflix. That's how that's how it sometimes works in coalition politics, but it's at least one take on this. Unfortunately, that's all we have time for today. I want to thank Nirmal Ghosh, Steve Erlanger, and Nahal Toosi for being with us, enlightening us on once again on the news from around the world. And this is it for this week, but be back next week for another round of the news and world review. In the meantime, thank you all and have a great weekend.
Thank you all.